Hello, welcome back. This will be the final version of Franz Fanon's on violence. And today we're going to talk about sort of the end of the paper, right? Um, and so we talked about sort of what leads to violence overall, what leads to a violent sort of civil sociability, and then what can lead to violence against the not the industrial, the colonial state. Um, and so he wants to discuss political violence as a political platform, right? And there are a few reasons that he sort of legitimizes political platforms as violent. He says, first, violence is just a clearly hot motivator, right? We know that calls to anger and sort of injustice or, this sort of victimhood language gets people more emotionally invested than just some discussions of policy wonkery, right? The second is the spread of globalization and the resource extraction of colonialism, um, and sort of the buildup of the urban areas, the Euro areas in the colonial systems, plus apartheid, sort of reinforce this notion that the quote unquote natives don't have anything, right? Look at all this stuff that exists that didn't really exist pre-colonialism, right? It was a pretty like agrarian society, tribal societies, these sorts of things. The colonials came in and took all of the wealth from the country land or the hinterland, and created these apartheid systems with extreme wealth inequalities. And this inevitably leads the quote unquote natives, the indigenous, to say, look at all this stuff we don't have. What is happening? Okay, the third one was a criticism of the United States led world order. And he basically says that the US led world order has led to sort of an embarrassingly non objective perspective on colonialism and colonial movements, especially those tied to communism, right? Which are always demonized by the West. So we have this whole Cold War using colonialism as a proxy for communism. And if you look historically at some of the people that are leading America in the 1950s, so you've got the Eisenhower administration, Truman, at least in the late 40s, early 50s. And then you start seeing Kennedy and the Dulles brothers, who are incredibly capitalistic and control enormous portions of the US government and have a lot of business interests in colonialism through the United Fruit Company, mining companies, etc. So there were some really nasty incentives inside the American government to use the tools of government to make lots and lots of money by demonizing communist and anti-colonial movements. So interesting history there. I don't really have time to get into all of it, but if anyone's interested in sort of the history of America's perspective toward anti-colonialism, you can look at all of that, right? So we were really involved in South America, especially where mining interests and agricultural interests were. We helped overthrow the Somoza government through the Sandinistas, the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, or we upheld the Somoza regime, who was a brutal, and some say genocidal regime. So there's lots of instances of this. Okay, so we'll move on. The fourth one, he says, was the problem here is for the West and the colonial powers to say that, force and violence is not a legitimate tool. They say, we're calling bullshit. You used force and violence against us as a legitimate political tool. Why should the tables not be turned on you? So it gives you a little bit of insight into why he thinks using political violence um, as politics is legitimate. All right. The last section, he moves from sort of a internal, um, state-centric, right? The sort of the subdivisions of an individual state to the international level. And so the first he says, and this is where he says basically his whole point is that the Western world owes these formerly colonial states massive, massive amounts of investment So first he says originally Europe was on the same footing, and so they were allowed to sort of develop in tandem for the most part, right? There were problems like the 30-Year War and things like this. Um, but they were allowed to develop in tandem as neighbors because they didn't necessarily constitute enemies or someone to be exploited, right? Because all the exploitation that was happening around the world really was colonial, right? Resource extraction and mercantilism rather than sort of war on war against European states. And so his argument here is that Europe was allowed to develop. And now that Europe is developed, they're sort of they don't want the rest of the developing world to develop alongside with them. Number two, the scene in the 1960s, according to Fanon, is vastly different, right? With Europe vastly outstripping the developing countries in every single aspect except resources. That's like the one thing that these colonial states have. That's why they were targets, is because they had resources: oil, gold, silver, platinum, coal, agricultural farmland, which Europe doesn't really have much of. And he says, quote, European opulence is literally a scandal, for it was built on the backs of slaves, it fed on the blood of slaves, and owes its very existence to the soil and subsoil of the underdeveloped world. Europe's well-being and progress were built with the sweat and corpses of blacks, Arabs, Indians, and Asians. So some really strong language here, and you can see he's very angry. Point three, even post colonization, the rich nations petulantly withdrew all of their technology, science, infrastructure, capital, investments, etc., and left the colonized countries with nothing. Fourth, the developing states should not become part of the bilateral Cold War and should strike their own path. So this is an interesting point he makes. It like we're not part of your sort of ridiculous communist versus capitalist extremist perspectives. We want to not get involved in that, and we want to strike our own path forward. And you're actually seeing this 60 years on, where a lot of these sort of secondary nations, a lot of them call them the BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and there are others, right? Like Iran, Turkey, um, arguably like a little country like Uruguay. These countries are gaining power in the international system, especially as sort of the American hegemonic Western influence sags. Like it's clearly sagging, right? And totalitarianism and dictatorship are on the rise again. Democracy is sort of crippled at best at the moment, and you're seeing these other countries, these BRICS countries, right? Brazil, South Africa, China, etc., not really wanting to be involved in this and sort of trying to strike their own path that is not necessarily in tandem with each other, but in a sense, at least tangentially, right? Because they're just trying to degrade the existing international order. They see it as different ways of doing that. And so, again, they're not necessarily allies, right? Like China and Russia and Iran and South Africa and Brazil, not necessarily all allies in a sense, but they do see incentives for cooperating in certain areas, especially when sort of degrading the US and European led international world order. Okay, number five. For centuries, this is a quote. For centuries, the capitalists have behaved like real war criminals in the underdeveloped world. Deportation, massacres, forced labor, and slavery were the primary methods used by capitalism to increase its gold and diamond reserves and establish its wealth and power. And then finally, he says international aid by Western countries, absolutely will not and should not be seen as charity, but rather as reparations, as it was stolen in the first place from their lands. Okay, that is it. It was a pretty brutal and devastating reading. Um, and I do not support political violence as politics. But um, I do think it's important for us to understand these criticisms and why people feel so justified in being violent. And that's what happens is when you use violence, violence perpetuates itself. And so violence was used against the colonial states, and violence was the answer they returned to the colonialists. So it is important that we understand where these things come from, even though I do not support political violence. But I will leave you with a last final quote by a man named Clausewitz. I think his first name was Wilhelm Clausewitz, a very famous military strategist. One of my degrees is in military strategy. And he said that war is simply the extreme extension of politics, right? So war is politics. War is power and the exertion of power and the competition for power. And so, in that sense, violence can be political. And Clausewitz would support that idea, although he probably would say, let's not let it get that far. So, I'll leave you with that. I will try to have Hannah Arendt's final lectures up in either today or tomorrow. Have a great day. Thank you.